силу сложившейся ситуации с образованием Содружества независимых государств я прекращаю свою деятельность на посту президента СССР.
It was the shock ending of an empire, or was it? Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to a special edition of the France 24 debate marking the 30th anniversary of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Growing up, it seemed that the zero-sum game of the Cold War would last forever. What did we see coming? What did we miss? As supplies ran low, stuff broke down, like the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The Red Army suffered setbacks in Afghanistan. And the Communist Party's grip started to loosen in the far reaches of an empire that stretched 11 time zones. By Christmas Day 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev was president of a federation that no longer existed, what with states declaring independence and forming the Commonwealth of Independent States. What's left of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire that preceded it? It's been a roller coaster ride since, with nations that are firmly in Moscow's sphere, like Belarus, and those who've left and joined the West, like the Baltic states and Georgia. Then there are those that remain a battleground, like present-day Ukraine. How does our reading of the past inform our understanding of the present? Today in the France 24 debate, what is left of the USSR? Joining us, he was spokesperson for the Soviet Union's last leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, academic Andrei Grachev. Your latest book in French, The Day the USSR Disappeared. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. When he was an American in Moscow, Craig Kapitas co-founded the newspaper Kommersant. His tales of foreshadowing to be found in the book Bear Hunting with the Politburo, American Adventures in Russian Capitalism. How are you?
Okay, Francois.
With us, if we talk about the ties that bind former Soviet states, it's certainly topical if, say, you're born in Belarus and teach in the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius. Tatiana Chulitskaya, researcher at Vietas Magnus University. Thanks for being with us.
Hello, thank you.
What's the soundtrack to an era? Well, from the Estonian capital, Tallinn, journalist and music critic Artemi Troitsky, author of Back in the USSR. Welcome to the show.
Oui, bonjour.
The France 24 debate, where you can always join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. At the outset of the 1980s, the Soviet Union is only on its third leader since the Second World War. It seems like continuity and stability. After the 1982 death of Leonid Brezhnev, though, come in quick succession Yuri Andropov, Konstantin Chernenko, and the man on the far left of this photo, the youngest member of the Communist Party Central Committee at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev. And when you look at the fact that in 1985, Gorbachev then goes on to become general secretary of the party, Andrei Grachev, did you know that that was going to be this seminal moment?
Well, I think that maybe Gorbachev himself was not as sure that the mandate he received would give him the possibility to transform to such extent the reality of his own country, but
because this is a man whose remit was agriculture. I think he'd only been outside of the Soviet Union once. He wasn't.
Well, he
didn't seem like someone who was open to
well, by origin, he comes from the agricultural region, the northern Caucasus. Then he was moved to become you're right, the secretary of the Central Committee responsible for agriculture, which was certainly a hopeless mission to be in charge of the branch of economy that certainly was at a loss practically since since the founding of the state. But then in the latest years, and particularly after Andropov became the first, successor to Brezhnev, Gorbachev, after Chernenko, who was the next one, took the position of number two, responsible for ideology. That means he became, to those who know a bit about Soviet political history, he became Mr. Suslov. the gray cardinal of the Politburo, the kingmaker, but also the shadow ruler of the party
And again, nothing
of the state.
Nothing at the time. It gives us an inkling in that day, in 1985, Craig Kapidis, that we're about to see this huge upheaval.
Well, if you look primarily at Gorbachev, no, but if you were on the streets of Moscow and then Leningrad, St. Petersburg, or out in the boondocks, you did see that an upheaval was coming. You saw it. There were many, many indications outside what we were hearing at the foreign ministry briefings. The agriculture thing was very important. It was a remit he could not deal with because there was very little food in the country, and there were lots of things. Briefly, there are many things that struck me. The one was it was just after Chernenko. For the first time, you saw people actually involving themselves in the black market valuta game. It used to be that there was like 78 cents, a dollar bought you 78 kopecks, okay? Back at that time on the black market, that you were getting anywhere early on from 40 to 70 rubles for every dollar. Now, prior to that, if you were involved in that kind of thing, the KGB was on you quicker than, a fly on you-know-what. And that wasn't there anymore. So that was one indicator. There were many that you could write a book on, which I did, but there were indicators that this was.
So what? You land in the country, you say to yourself, "Oh, this is ripe for a huge change, or even a collapse."
Well, no, you saw that it was collapsing, and from what I saw at the time, which was counterintuitive, maybe to this day, Gorbachev was the only one who could pull it off. Gorbachev, believe it or not, was actually a Democrat. When the Soviet Union fell and Yeltsin took power, Gorbachev talked about something, if I remember correctly, called the preventative revolution. Gorbachev knew damn well that Yeltsin would lead to Putin. He knew this for a whole host of reasons, and he tried to prevent it, but the political will was not there.
Let's get back to that in a moment. If we're fishing for moments of foreshadowing, we can, of course, speak of the invasion of Afghanistan or of rock and roll music. In 1980, a music festival is held in Tbilisi, capital of Georgia. Groups include Boris Grebenshchikov's Aquarium. This festival, which Artemy Troitsky can seem tame by today's standards, did you know at that time in 1980, again, this is long before Gorbachev, that this was perhaps a change on the way?
Well, I think that that culturally and ideologically, the Soviet Union, hasn't collapsed yet, but it was already defeated a long time before it was totally fini. Back in the 70s, millions of people in the Soviet Union were listening to Voice of America, the BBC, Radio Liberty, and so on. They've been hunting for American jeans, for French perfume. They knew very well, perfectly well, that the Western way of life and the Western civilization is superior to what we have in our peaceful, mighty, but kind of totally boring Soviet Union. And this was also the launching for rock music, which became hugely popular back in the 70s. The Beatles were the first sign of these phenomena. Western music was more popular among Soviet young people and Soviet intelligent people than
So did rock and roll bring down the Soviet Union?
Well, this is a popular theory, but I think that if we talk about, say, the emotional and the cultural component of the breakdown of the Soviet Union, then I'm pretty sure that that music did play quite a large part in it.
Francois, may I just briefly add? You know, there's a lot of truth to that. And there was a singer at the time, you talk of Aquarium, Grabeshnikov, he wrote a song which really told the story. It was called The Young Lions. And I'm sure Tim knows this song much better than I do. And if my translation is correct, there's a very important line in that song. And everything that was mine will still go to someone else. And that was the theme going from Gorbachev to Yeltsin and on.
Tatiana Chulitskaya, what's your religion when it comes to Soviet rock of the time?
I totally like the idea that the USSR was collapsed by rock and roll, but from like political science point of view, from analytical point of view, of course there were a lot of factors which actually influenced the collapse of the USSR, and there were like internal and external factors. Among internal factors, I would name, and it was named by my colleagues, like policy of glasnost and perestroika, and they were extremely important one because they actually created ground for like systematic collapse of the Soviet Union. But we should also remember about external developments, and among external developments, there were like situation in other were interconnected with the USSR, which were in the sphere of the influence of the USSR. And situation there was also, you know, a kind of a changing one. But also what is important is that was a situation of oil crisis at that time. And that's why like USSR was losing one of the main source of its like budgeting and financing. And of course, the war in Afghanistan was among the very, very important factors which influenced the whole situation with the collapse. So I would say that, and I totally agree that the collapse of the USSR was not an unexpected event. It was a kind of a logical development of everything what was going on at that time. However, probably the very moment was a kind of a surprise or unexpected one for many like analysts and many historians.
Yes, we went from surprise to surprise, Andrei Grachev. November 1985, so just months after Gorbachev becomes the leader, on the banks of Lake Geneva, he meets Ronald Reagan, across from where, by the way, Vladimir Putin met Joe Biden earlier this year. And that was a surprise to everyone at the time.
Well, surprise. Well, I wouldn't qualify it like this, because meetings on the summit between the Soviet and American leaders, were not sensational. What was, in fact, new and radically new was certainly the new face of a leader coming from this icy capital, which was the Soviet Empire. The man who, I had the chance to be in the group that accompanied Gorbachev to this Geneva summit, and I remember that in our internal meetings, he didn't stop repeating what was his basic intention. He was saying, I want to try to show to the West, and from this point of view, he was rightly considering Reagan to be the leader of the West, that there are different faces and new people in Moscow, and I want to break this ice of mistrust that reigns over our relations for
And he succeeded in spades, because he appears as this young reformer versus the old cold warrior who was Reagan.
Not immediately, because, certainly, having a new vigorous leader at the head of the Soviet state was provoking a different kind of reactions in the West, because many were believing that after dying Brezhnev and decaying Andropov and half-living Chernenko. A new vigorous leader would, on the contrary, provide new, fresh blood in this decaying empire and state, which was, I agree from this point of view with Artemi, who was saying that the whole system was kind of dying inside.
Right.
And from this point of view, Gorbachev could be either or. He could be a more vigorous, more dynamic, more aggressive, and from this point of view, a more dangerous leader for the West. So their first meeting in Geneva was, I would say, just a shaky, a hesitant search for understanding, and maybe Reagan was right to take the initiative to suggest to Gorbachev to call each other by their first names. And one of the unexpected questions he asked Gorbachev was, Michael, imagine that the United States is attacked by the extraterrestrials. Can we count on the Soviet support in this case? And Gorbachev immediately reacted, you can imagine in what way. So Reagan already left reassured.
All right. And you mentioned Spaceship, December of 1987. There's a state visit to Washington, Mikhail Gorbachev accompanied by then Vice President George Bush, when he orders the motorcade to halt and bolts out to pound the flesh with gobsmacked locals. The New York Times' Maureen Dowd wrote she'd never seen a motorcade go in reverse before. If a spaceship had landed in the middle of Washington, it could not have caused more commotion. Pedestrians quivered with excitement. The Secret Service looked terrified. The KGB looked stunned. Craig Kapitas.
I remember it well, both that event and the summit in Geneva. People liked Gorbachev. I can tell you from the American side, I talked to many of the people years afterwards who were at all of those summits. At first, they were very scared that Reagan and Gorbachev were getting on so well. This cold cocked them. They were not used to this kind of discussion taking place. So it's very, very clear that if it wasn't for Gorbachev, the entire system probably would have continued to crumble for a lot longer.
And while all this is going on, Artemi Troitsky, you're co-organizing the Soviet answer to Live Aid, if you will, a benefit concert for those at Chernobyl, at the nuclear disaster, survivors and families. What was your view on what was happening?
Well, strangely enough, this whole venture, which of course was a complete novelty for the Soviet Union, but it was fully approved by Gorbachev and Alexander Yakovlev, the main ideological force between Mikhail Gorbachev, the so-called producer of Perestroika. So when we decided to do this concert, we first of all, Alla Pugacheva, the biggest Soviet pop star of that time, and me, we went to the Central Committee of the Communist Party in order to get some kind of permission, green light, to start this innovative initiative. And they suddenly said, yeah, it's a great idea. The whole world is sympathizing with Chernobyl, and yes, we also have to do something humanitarian, something touching, something cultural about that. And strangely, we've got our hands totally free to do anything. So instead of inviting all the Soviet-style performers to play at this benefit concert, we have asked popular rock bands, including even some so-called unofficial or underground rock bands, to perform there. And there was a very funny but symbolic episode then. right before the beginning of the concert, there suddenly was a delegation from the Ministry of Culture of the USSR, and they told me, there are some bands on the list who are not officially recognized. They are official bands, and we demand that they are taken off the list of performers. And I just told them, well, you can go and ask Alexander Yakovlev about that, but I personally, I can tell you, go and, okay.
Right. Right. Pardon your Russian. Tatiana Chulitskaya, organizing benefit concerts like they do in the West for Chernobyl. Again, when we talk about seminal moments, we mention in broad brushstrokes the war in Afghanistan. How important, though, was Chernobyl?
I think that Chernobyl was very important one. I mean, I hardly could share my personal experience because I was a small one. I mean, I was a child at that time. But, even from my personal memory, I remember, and I lived in Mogilev, so it's in the eastern part of Belarus. And actually, that was a territory which suffered from Chernobyl a lot. And the biggest problem, I mean, from the everyday point of view, was that people did not know about it. I mean, there were a lot of rumors. There were a lot of, concerns. People knew that something had happened. However, like ordinary people in the Soviet Union at that time, my parents, my grandparents, they yet didn't know what happened. And so they were concerned. But I mean, talking from political point of view, of course, like this Chernobyl catastrophe, it demonstrated the whole problematic issues with the policy of non-disclosure of publicly important information. And I think that this case, it vividly demonstrated to the Soviet people that they need more information, that information should be spread by the government. So this policy of glassness, which was promoted, it was a normal answer or a kind of an adequate answer to what people were demanding and what they were expecting from the government at that time. And I would also share the point of view that here Gorbachev himself demonstrated as being a really democratic politician. I mean, of course, with all the nuances of Soviet time, but actually this policy of glassness and idea of undiscover or uncover what happened with Chernobyl, it was essential for the Soviet society.
Yeah, so the opening up, the changes on the way. Of course, there was going to be blowback, and conservative circles, Craig Kapitas mentioned in the U.S., but also on the Soviet side. And there was a push by the old guard in 1991, the so-called August coup, for 3 days. Tanks are on the streets, and while Gorbachev is cut off from events in Moscow in his dacha, it's Russian President Boris Yeltsin who leads the resistance. And while the coup is thwarted, and along with it the attempt to halt the reforms, the end of the Soviet Union is now just 4 months away. In 2007, Mikhail Gorbachev expressed regrets over later announcing the end of the Soviet Union. He spoke to France 24's Ulysse Gosset.
Меня никто не отправлял в отставку. Я не подавал заявление.
No one sent me into retirement. I didn't officially resign. The biggest mistake was in the collapse of the Soviet Union. It didn't happen because of the West. That's rubbish. But you said that Gorbachev resigned. No. When I saw what had been agreed in Almaty, I went on television and I said, I am ceasing my activities as president. I couldn't help but stop. I could have started turning it around. I could have convened the old Congress of People's Deputies, convened the High Soviet. I could have called in the army, but I saw there would have been a split. It was obvious, despite what people voted for in March, that the Union could have been saved.
So, with hindsight, is that semantics the way he's describing? Because it sure looked like a resignation with that speech on December 25th, 1991.
No, it's not semantic, at least in his mind, because actually, I think even until now, he doesn't feel himself having resigned. Not from the position, from his status of the president of the Soviet Union, because the state is nowhere, but from his mission, from his project, from his ambition. Mm-hmm. I would even say from his gamble, historic one. And from this point of view, well, he feels naturally upset that one of the tools of the realization of this mission, the state structure, it has collapsed, as you rightly said, in August 1991. So from this point of view, well, certainly he is not really sincere when he's saying
that he do the right thing?
Could have used the means to secure the state structure. No, certainly he couldn't, because starting from the KGB, the party, and the army, the three basic instruments of keeping that state, well, let's say, alive, have betrayed him. So the only thing that remained for him was the address to the people, to the nation, to the structures that he himself has created. And this is why he is referring to the meeting in Almaty and not to the meeting of the
Almaty, where there's the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States.
Almaty was the meeting of the heads of the 11 republics who had formally decided and announced the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but that was preceded by the voting in the parliaments. And Gorbachev was telling me, what should I have done? Open fire on the parliaments? But it took me so much effort, and it made me pay such a huge price to create those parliaments with the free elections. So what should I have done? So he has inclined, in a way, to the results of his own work.
Dr. Peters?
That footage you showed a few moments ago of Yeltsin on the tank is one of those seminal points in history where if one other thing had happened, it would have turned out completely different. I want to take you back to that point in time. Gorbachev had just been released from house arrest in the South, and he's coming north. There was a feeling among many people there that Gorbachev would come to the White House. And he would,
just explain what the White House is.
The White House was the Russian state headquarters, essentially, down on the Moskva River. It's where Yeltsin's office was at the time. And that Gorbachev would arrive there and stand up on the tank with Yeltsin together, which would solidify his so-called preventive revolution. And he didn't show up. And the reason he didn't show up, and I'm hoping that Andrei might shed a bit more light on this, because this is one of the great, perhaps untold stories of Russia, deserving of the pen of Boris Pasternak. It's a love story. Mm-hmm. He comes back with Raisa, and Raisa is ill, very ill. She is dying. Wife. And Mikhail Sergeyevich had a choice. He could stay with the woman he loved, or he could go down to the White House and perhaps climb atop the tank with Yeltsin and change the course of history. And he made the decision to stay with the woman he loved. That transcends any politic. It is out of the pages of Pasternak. Had he gone down there, perhaps history would have been different. And when Gorbachev later won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990, very few people know what he did with a big portion of that money. He gave it to a newspaper called Novaya Gazeta, whose editor just yesterday was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Gorbachev was a Democrat. Sadly, the time, the politic, and a lot of other things conspired to keep him out of that loop.
Andrei Grachev?
Yeah, that's totally correct.
He had the choice, and he chose to go by his wife's bedside?
Going not, to the office of Yeltsin, but to address the crowd of Muscovites that were surrounding and protecting this residence of the Russian parliament as a symbol of resistance. And people there, in fact, were waiting for him.
Precisely.
In the night. But you're right when you remind that Raisa was half paralyzed because once they were in Foros, in their dacha in the Crimea, she learned from the radio that according to the version of the putschist who staged the coup, Gorbachev was so heavily ill that he couldn't perform his duties. And once she learned that a plane with the members of this coup team was flying in the direction of Crimea, she was very much afraid because she feared that they were coming in order, actually to perform in a way that they produce proofs that Gorbachev is so ill or maybe incapable of functioning as a president. So Gorbachev, once having descended from the plane, she accompanied Raisa home to comfort her, and as another proof of what characterizes Gorbachev and makes the difference with the other political leaders, not only in Russia, he showed the proof that for him, human was superior to the state.
Humanity
and that was
superior to
also
the state.
the sense of the mission.
Artemy Troitsky, how do you remember those days of August 1991?
I think this was the best party that Moscow seen in its entire history. I was there in the White House and around the White House all 3 days, and it's been very scary, but also tremendously inspiring. I must say that 90% of the people who gathered around the White House were young people. So in many ways, this was a youth revolution, not a revolution of the political class. Frankly speaking, I've never heard this romantic story of Gorbachev not appearing on the tank along with Yeltsin because of Raisa Maximovna's illness. But in any case, I think, if we talk about human values, this was probably a very good decision, but politically, I think it was a very bad decision. And I think that it hasn't happened only because of Raisa Gorbacheva, but also because of Gorbachev's very tense and unpleasant relations with Boris Yeltsin. Generally speaking, if we talk about the general impact of the fall of the Soviet Union, I think in many ways it was a generational story. Because for the young people, it didn't mean a big thing. I don't think that when the British Empire or the French Empire collapsed, a lot of young people in Britain or France really did care about, what will happen to the colonies, what will happen to all those distant places and the so-called Warsaw Pact and so on. We didn't care about that, but people of the older generation, they were all for the Soviet Union. And I remember that, I shared almost all my political views with my father, who, by the way, knew Mikhail Gorbachev quite well and traveled with him also several times. So I remember that this was the only issue on which we've had major arguments. Because for my father, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a tragedy. For me personally, it was nothing special.
Right. So a generation gap that appears at the time that the Soviet Union is dissolving. And by the way, when the Soviet Union dissolved, they forgot about Sergei Krikalev, one of Russia's greatest cosmonauts, was aboard the Mir space station in December of 1991. Mission control in Baikonur was no longer in the Soviet Union suddenly, but in independent Kazakhstan. He would spend nearly a year in space before Germany helped finance his rotation out. When he landed, his native Leningrad had reverted back to being called St. Petersburg. You look back at the sudden change. Tatiana Chulitskaya, you mentioned being young at the time. Of course, did Belarus look any different before or after December of 1991?
Yes, from my personal perspective, once again, it's very, like blur memory, but I still remember, broadcasting on TV, and my parents and grandparents, they were watching like what was going on in Moscow. And actually, I think that they had mixed feelings because my father, he was a member of the Communist Party, and for him, it was a kind of a collapse of the whole world system. I mean, for him, it was a kind of a shock. Also, he was a kind of a progressive-minded, so like it was really like a complicated situation for all the ordinary people and those who were like party members, I believe. But for Belarus itself, of course, I mean, it meant a lot, and for those who were like younger, or those who were, more pro-national building, like after the USSR collapse, of course, it was a time of a great opportunity. I mean, actually, the collapse of the Soviet Union opened an opportunity for not my generation, but for a bit older generation to start a new state. Unfortunately, we know what happened later on, but still, I think the year 1991, 1994 in Belarusian history are very important. And if these years were longer, probably we won't have like in Belarus
because
today.
This is the perception in the West, Svetlana, that when we saw those big protests against the post-election crackdown in Minsk in August of 2020, the feeling was, seen from the outside, that time had stood still in Belarus. Is that a right or a wrong perception?
It's a complicated story. I would say that on the level of the Lukashenko's political elite, time has really stopped. I mean, like Lukashenko is dreaming to come back to Soviet time, but to his own imagined Soviet time. And indeed, like this Lukashenko's elites, they have a kind of this, pro-Soviet nostalgia. Also, I'm not like 100% sure that they really like understand what did it mean, to rule within the Soviet system. But still, they dream about it, they think about it, and they publicly announce that it's like it would be good to have such system as it was in the Soviet Union. However, from the point of view of not just younger generation, but from progressive generation. And what we saw in 2020, it was like real like mobilization of Belarusian population, and like people of different ages, of different professions, they came to the street. And even up till now, I mean, there are no like active protests, but people are not satisfied with what they have. They do not have, like this broad nostalgia towards what political elites think as a good pro-Soviet political project. So basically, people in Belarus, they are forced to live in a kind of pro-Soviet reality, but they are totally not satisfied.
Still living in a pro-Soviet reality. Artemy Troitsky, you're sitting in Estonia, which is one of these Baltic states that bolted as soon as they could. I mean, the euro is the currency where you are. So listening to what you're hearing there from Tatiana, what's your reaction?
What's my reaction to what? Sorry.
To the fact that in some places, the former Soviet Union, former Soviet states are still firmly in Moscow's sphere, and in others, like where you are, time has really moved on.
Unfortunately, in the 90s, and especially in this century under Putin's rule, all the democratic achievements that we've been enjoying in the late 80s, in the times of perestroika and glasnost and so on, they have eventually, gradually and eventually fade. Unlike many Russian liberally minded people, I'm not a big fan of Boris Yeltsin, simply because I can see that a lot of things that have flourished later, again, under Putin's fascist regime, they have been started in the 90s, like the Chechen War, like the shelling of parliament in 1993, like the first totally forged and falsified elections in 1996. Although Yeltsin was a very controversial person. There were some good points about him. Like, he was really the advocate of the freedom of speech, and the media in Russia in the 90s, they've been absolutely free. Economically speaking, also he was on the right side. But otherwise he couldn't do nothing about some very basic and awful features of the Soviet and the Russian autocratic regimes.
Right.
And this, of course, led to today's Russia and to today's Belarus, which indeed are totally autocratic dictatorships.
Right. So it led to what we have today. We talked earlier about rock music. France 24 went to Georgia and Svetikoshvili Cathedral. That's in the historic town of Mechetka, home to an Orthodox church since the 4th century. The superior there told us that in Soviet times, he was an atheist who worked for state security services and informed on those who went to church.
There was nothing in the law that banned the church, but communists knew that they could not be seen praying. Some used to go to church secretly. The names of those who got caught were put on a list. The people on it would not get good jobs. Some actually got fired. These measures lasted until the end of the Soviet Union, until the 90s. After that, when we started fighting for independence, the relations changed. The church took the lead. Other political forces were vying for support from it.
Craig Kapitas?
Number one, don't confuse Russian Orthodoxy with any type of religion in the West. Orthodox Church is not a theocracy as such. It's a religion of spiritualism, with more closely related to Buddhism than anything else. This is why Putin is Orthodoxy. He is a spiritual man. That doesn't mean he's a good man. It means he's spiritual. And what he created was indeed the perfect mafia state, better than Meyer Lansky, the head of the mob, could ever. Don't laugh. It is true. It is absolutely true. And the way he did this, analysts usually go to Putin and say he was a KGB agent. Beware. Well, he was. But they're discounting something very, very important. He was also an attorney, and he learned law under a guy by the name of Anatoly Sobchak, who was his mentor. Sobchak was a business lawyer. Putin specialized in business law. And the moment the walls came tumbling down, Sobchak and Putin went on their grand tour to scoop up failed Soviet enterprises, which started his business. He then started to amass money, lots of it, and he put it in the West. Fast forward for a moment to the Ukraine. You know, anyone who says they know what's going to happen in Russia is the kind of person who says, I don't get drunk on champagne. Don't believe him. But Putin will probably not invade Ukraine, because if he does, he's going to lose his supply route. He has a product. It's petrochemicals. He invades. That's cut off. All his money is cut off. I don't see him doing it because of
One quick final word. Andrei Grachev, that superior going from being a KGB informant to being an Orthodox priest?
Well, to be very brief about it, well, first thing I didn't know, you need to be a spiritual person to found a mafia. But
Indeed you do.
What I would say, well, I never met and I never talked to Putin, but my impression is that Putin's religion is power. And from this point of view, he could be, as at his beginning, maybe the successor to Sobchak, a kind of adopted son or something of the kind. He could also be the godfather of the newly born mafia. From this point, you're right. But he is a very pragmatic figure. He is ideological, I would say. And from this point of view, I would share what you're saying. I don't believe he is going to invade Ukraine because he may, let's say, make believe that he is capable in order to impress the West and to get from it as much as he wishes. But he is too pragmatical to destroy, let's say, the foundation of his power.
A foundation of a power which goes back far. And yes, the future is unwritten. Andrei Grachev, I want to thank you so much for being with us. I want to thank Craig Kopidis, Artemy Troitsky for being with us from Tallinn, Tatiana Chulitskaya in Vilnius. Thank you for being with us here in this special edition of the France 24 debate.